Now, listen, let's be clear here out of the gate. I'm going to try to do something some of you will like, some of you won't like. Instead of just going off on tariffs, I don't think tariffs are a good idea. I at least want to try to, as objectively as someone with biases can, explain what's actually happening. Let's do the analysis before we do anything else. And the first thing to understand where Donald Trump started and his starting point on tariffs is to understand what a trade deficit is. When I was growing up, I would read the newspaper. As a kid, yes, I was a nerd, and I would hear trade deficit. We had a trade deficit with Mexico at the time. We had a trade deficit with Japan. The trade deficit must be bad. Once I got into college and had to take economics classes, realized actually a trade deficit is a term. It's neither good nor bad. It's just a term. What is a trade deficit? You hear deficit like you think the federal deficit, that's bad. So you hear trade deficit, you think that's bad. This is actually just it's a basic term in economics. It is neither a good thing nor a bad thing, although it tends to be good. Let me explain. Trade deficits come about when your country imports more from a country than they import from you. So, for example, we have a trade deficit with Vietnam. The Vietnamese, even the wealthy Vietnamese, are poor compared to us. You need to understand this, the poorest Americans are actually wealthier than about 75 to 80% of the planet. We think about poor Americans. You go to Appalachia, you go to a American Indian reservation, you see poor Americans. We think that is poverty. And then you compare it to poverty on planet Earth. It's actually not as bad as you think it is. It's not good, but it's not as bad as you think it is. A poor American can buy more from Vietnam than a wealthy Vietnamese can buy from the United States. So we have a trade deficit with Vietnam. The things we make, we have higher labor costs, we have a higher quality of life, we have higher regulatory burdens. So to make a good in the United States is more expensive than to make a good in Vietnam. So poor Americans are wealthier than wealthy Vietnamese. So poor Americans can buy more Vietnamese stuff than a wealthy Vietnamese person can buy from the United States. So we buy more from them than they buy from us. That's a trade deficit. Now, oddly enough, we have a trade surplus with Australia. Australia is a wealthy nation, but not as wealthy as us. But Australia, if you've ever been to Australia, has more of a limited manufacturing base than we do. So Australia buys a lot of American vehicles. Australia buys a lot of American airplanes. Australia buys a lot of Harley Davidsons. Australia buys a lot of GM, Ford, Stellantis vehicles, many of which are actually made in this country and sent there. Yeah, they got Subaru, but that's about it. So major manufacturing, actually, we have a trade surplus with Australia. We sell more to them than they sell to us. A trade deficit typically comes about, and I mentioned Australia because it's a little bit of difference here. A trade deficit comes about when a wealthy nation buys a lot of stuff from a poor country. The poor country can't afford to buy as much stuff from the wealthy nation. So wealthy nations tend to run trade deficits with poor countries. Australia is poorer than us. We actually are the wealthiest country on the planet. And even our poor are wealthier than most of the poor people and even some of the middle class people around the world. We run this trade surplus with Australia because Australia doesn't make the things that we do make that Australia needs. But almost all the cases, Europeans have trade deficits with Southeast Asian countries. The United States has trade deficits with Southeast Asian countries. Australia has trade deficits with Southeast Asian countries. And again, you hear deficit, you think bad. It actually isn't bad. It just means that we're so rich, we can buy a whole lot more of their cheap stuff than they can buy of even our cheap stuff. That's all it is it's a documentation of a trade imbalance. And the trade imbalance is actually a sign of our wealth. Because we are so wealthy as a nation, we can buy so much of other people's stuff. We tend to have imbalanced trade with these other countries, and we tend to have the trade deficit. Now, here's the problem. Is as long as he's been in business, Donald Trump has done what I used to do, and that hear the word deficit, think this is bad. They must be taking advantage of us. It's actually not a sign that a poor country is taking advantage of us. It's a sign that You can make a good cheaper in their country than in our country, so we can buy more of their stuff than they can buy of our stuff. That's all a trade deficit is. But Donald Trump seems to have it in his head that this is bad. So yesterday at the White House, when he released his tariff package, he produced a list of every country on the planet and what the tariff is from that country. So Vietnam is the great example. He says Vietnam has a 90% tariff on U.S. goods. Vietnam does not have a 90% tariff on us. And I want to be real clear here that the numbers, in fact, I saw someone on Twitter, he came after me and he said, what some of these countries have 50% tariffs on us, Erickson. What's wrong with us having a 50% tariff on the people who have 50% tariff on us? Because they don't. I know that's what the Council of Economic Advisors is telling you, and some of you wish to believe it, but it's actually not only not true, they used a formula that no economist uses other than these guys came up with this. There literally is the formula that they used makes no sense. So here's what they did. To figure out what they're calling the tariff from Vietnam, they took our trade deficit with Vietnam, which is $123.5 billion. $123.5 billion. That's Vietnam's, that's our trade deficit with Vietnam. So Vietnam exports to the United States $136.6 billion. We export to Vietnam. Let me pull up my calculator here. I thought I had it written down and I don't. So 136.6 minus 123.5. So we export to Vietnam $13.1 billion. In other words, we buy, as a nation, we're so much richer than Vietnam. We buy $123.5 billion more dollars per year from the Vietnamese than they buy from us. So what Donald Trump's team did is they put this formula together. The trade deficit, which is $123.5 billion, divided by the total amount of exports from Vietnam, 136.6. They multiplied it by 100, they get 90. So what they're saying on their chart is that Vietnam has a 90% tariff on the United States. That's not really true. What Vietnam has is a trade surplus against us. We have a trade deficit against them. It's the entire chart through that the Trump team uses for tariffs isn't actually true. And I do need you to understand that. And yes, I am calling them out on this because it actually is a lie to say, for example, the European Union has a 39% tariff on us. That's not actually true. What it is that the European Union actually, essentially, the European Union exports to the United States about 39% more than we export to them. Vietnam exports to us about 90% more than we export to them. That's all it is. And the Trump team is saying this is a tariff on the United States because Donald Trump himself profoundly misunderstands what a trade deficit is. He thinks it's a bad thing, and it's really not. Now, the wild thing about the chart overall you need to understand is that there are places on the chart that are listed as being impacted by the tariff that don't even have people. So Heard and McDonald Islands, according to Donald Trump, they have a 10% tariff on our goods. So we're going to impose a 10% tariff on them. Heard and McDonald Islands don't have people. Heard and McDonald Islands have penguins. Now, this is actually kind of funny. You can laugh about it, but it actually is very serious. It makes you wonder who advised the president on this, that they're listing Heard and McDonald Island as now islands that will have an American tariff imposed on them on so-called Liberation Day, because literally there's not a soul on those islands. You can go tour those islands if you want. They're in the Indian Ocean. They are controlled by Australia, and they're uninhabited. They are penguin safe havens. Yeah, I'm not making that up. They're penguin safe havens, and people aren't allowed to live on those islands. So a lot of people are saying, why are we adding Heard and McDonald Island to tariffs when there are no one there? Or Jan Mayen Island. Jan Mayen Island is actually in the North Sea off the coast of Norway. 17 people live on that island. They are a combined team of American and Norwegian researchers. They're scientists that don't actually have an industrial base in Jan Mayen Island, which according to this list has a 10% tariff on American goods. It simply doesn't have any industrial base to sell us anything. Now, if you want a larger perspective on this, when you look at Donald Trump's list, and there's a familiar pattern here, for example, he says Vietnam has a 90% tariff on us. South Korea has a 50% tariff on us. Japan has a 46% tariff. Taiwan has a 64% tariff. Pakistan has a 58% tariff. Laos has a 95% tariff. What's actually going on here is, again, these are very poor countries that manufacture a lot of things for Walmart, for Target, for other companies. They import them into this country and they sell them to you for cheap because it's cheaper to build the products there than here. That's what's actually happening with the tariffs. But so the president has decided across the board 10% tariff to start with, and then he will mark up tariffs everywhere else. So like Vietnam, he's going to impose a 46% tariff on Vietnam, claiming they have a 90% tariff on us, which isn't true. The 46% tariff on Vietnam is designed to get American manufacturers to move their manufacturing back to the United States from Vietnam. Now, there's a little bit of a problem with this. Let's talk about oil companies for a second. So oil companies, you would think, would be making major investments in the country right now because Donald Trump is president, except they're not. The reason is not because of Donald Trump, not because of terrorists. It's because it can take for an oil manufacturer to begin exploration, drilling, development, and production of oil. It can take up to 20 years to actually return an investment for investors. Because oil companies aren't sure which way the winds are going to blow in the United States over the next 20 years. They're slow walking new development because a Democrat could get back into office and try to shut them down again. Now, let's take a manufacturer who's moved their economic base to Vietnam to produce goods for Americans cheaply. Nike is a prime example of this. Nike has moved a lot of its manufacturing out of China into Vietnam so that they're not using slave labor and they're not relying on the communist Chinese. Instead, the communist Vietnamese, who are actually more pro-American than you might realize, they don't like the Chinese. So if Nike were to shut down Vietnam and move back to the United States, it's going to take 4 to 5 years for them to build a facility here. You got to plan it, you got to zone it, you got to get certifications, then you build it. Then you got to train the workforce. By then, Donald Trump is gone. There's a new president. Maybe the tariffs go away. Or maybe Donald Trump next year decides to get rid of the tariffs. Why pour a lot of research and development into new facilities in the United States when in next year, 4 years from now, the tariffs might go away? There's an opportunity cost. There's an opportunity loss. There is a shareholder investment that has to be made. And so a lot of these companies, they don't have a clear path ahead, and that's somewhat problematic for where the president wants to go. His intent is to stimulate American production. And essentially what Donald Trump wants to do is to build a trade wall around the United States. If you trade inside the United States, you're going to get the best, beautiful deals possible. If you're trading across country lines, you're going to get slammed with tariffs. This is designed to bring a lot of companies into the United States. He's well-intentioned, trying to bring a lot of companies into the United States. The problem is there's still so much uncertainty, and there's an election in 2 years or a year and a half for the midterms, and then 3 years for the presidency, 3.5 years. That could change the dynamic. So if a company that might take 5 to 6 years to build the investment here suddenly no longer needs to build the investment here in 3 to 4 years, they may not actually do what Donald Trump wants them to do today. They may be gambling on the uncertainty, which might actually have negative political ramifications for Donald Trump. There are political ramifications that you have to examine for this, but that's the president's intention. You do need to understand, though, that part of the basis here is a misunderstanding of what a trade deficit is. Hello there. Welcome. It's Erick Erickson here. The phone number is 877-973-7425. Should you wish to be on the show, I'm trying to explain the reason for the tariffs, the logic behind it. I will play you when we come back some of President Trump's own words as he talks about it. Let me just give you perspective on this. This is objectively true. This isn't my opinion. This is a fact. That if the baseline actually is 10% across the board tariffs on imports, that will be higher than any developed country on the planet has. Our baseline right now is about 1.73%. We would take it up to 10%. That puts us in the range of third world African hellholes. There are a number of African third world undeveloped nations that have 10% tariffs. Kenya actually has a 9% tariff, but a lot of worse countries than Kenya have 10% or higher. No developed nation on the planet actually has a tariff as high as what the U.S. would have. South Korea is the highest of developed nations. South Korea has an 8% tariff. Now, Donald Trump says their tariff is much higher on us. Here's the thing, though. We have a free trade agreement with South Korea, and 90% of all goods from the United States to South Korea have a 0% tariff placed on them. The other 10% have a tariff no higher than 0.79%. Switzerland's another example where we're slamming the Swiss for a tariff that they supposedly have in the country, but we have a free trade agreement with Switzerland. 99% of all goods we ship to Switzerland do not get a tariff placed on them because we have a free trade deal with Switzerland. So I don't know where the White House came up with these numbers. We will find out at some point, I guess. Divorce. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, of course. There are some people who it's a sad situation. I've actually got a very dear friend of mine who his mother was just a horrible alcoholic and started cheating on her husband. It was just a terrible thing, and she walked out in the middle of the night and left him. And the dad wasn't an extraordinary father, but certainly became one, having to keep his family together. And there are, like, my friend who that happened to says it was actually for the good that his mother left. And I've got friends who the same thing, the father left. But they're the exceptions. Overwhelmingly, it is a child whose parents divorced. They never want to go through it themselves. And you see it as someone from a family that there was no divorce. You can see it. Now, why do I bring that up relating to tariffs of all things? Eric, so what are you doing here? Because I want you to understand that there are things you yourself don't experience, but you can see the consequences of the actions of when it goes the other way. So your parents may not have gotten a divorce, but you know so many people whose parents did, and you see the ramifications of the divorce. You might have gone through the divorce and you see the ramifications. We as a country are essentially setting up a policy here, for better or worse, that divorces us from a lot of the global supply chain and our leadership in the world. Donald Trump is essentially signaling we're done with American leadership of the world. We're going to leave the world behind, and we're going to take care of our people first. It will be America first. And my personal view here is that for the people who say, for example, we've been the piggy bank of the world, we've been taken advantage of by the world, the world is screwing us, that they've cost us jobs and the like, you have the luxury of saying that by not experiencing the other side of the equation. For those of you who believe the cost of American leadership in the world is too great, you've been very lucky that you haven't had to experience the cost of our lack of leadership in the world. And I'm afraid the day is coming, if we continue down this path, where you're going to, and when you get there, you're not going to like it, and it's going to be largely irreversible. Here's what you get that you don't feel right now. You get the greatest exchange rate on planet Earth. The bulk of all world trade is conducted in dollars, and that means when your dollar goes out into the globe to buy something, you get the best rate on it. So your products are cheaper. You get a lot of products that are very cheap. Donald Trump complains about our wipeout of the manufacturing base in this country, but do you really need to buy the T-shirt that's made in the United States when you can get one cheaper from Vietnam and then have money left over to buy something else? J.D. Vance a couple of months ago said the American dream doesn't involve buying cheap toasters. Actually, yeah, it sure as hell does involve buying a cheap toaster from Vietnam so that you have more money to spend on your kids' private education or your kids' college or to buy a better car or to buy a better house. Buying the cheap toaster frees up your resources to buy other stuff. It's not just a mercantilist capitalist equation, though, because where do you put your money? You can put your money to charity. You can put your money to your kids' education. You can put your money to your own house. You can put your money to other things that you have if you buy the cheap toaster instead of the expensive toaster. And we get to buy the cheapest toasters on the planet because we lead the world. Our global interest rates are better here. Go to Great Britain to buy a house. Go to Europe to buy a house. Your interest rate's going to be higher than it is here. Your interest rate here is cheaper than there because the world trades in dollars. The dollar is the reserve currency of planet Earth. Virtually every country on the earth will accept a dollar instead of their own currency because the dollar is so well accepted. China, Russia, Iran, South Africa, Brazil, the BRIC nations, and a number of others are working very hard with a lot of countries to get them to ditch the American currency as the global reserve currency. The global reserve currency means that countries buy American dollars to protect themselves from economic calamity. If they sell their American dollars, that not only devalues the American dollar, but it makes it harder for you to travel the world. It makes it far more expensive for you to travel around the planet. It makes it more expensive for you to get an interest rate. It makes you more expensive to do an exchange rate around the world. All those sorts of things that happen when you get rid of the reserve currency of the United States. We have the American dollar as the reserve currency because we lead the world. Think about SWIFT banking transactions. You know how we're very good at stamping out terrorism around the world? We're very good. We're not perfect. Terror plots still happen, things like that. But the SWIFT exchange, so many bank processing, because we're the world's reserve currency and the dollar is so respected, much of the world transacts its business in dollars, and those transactions flow through the United States, allowing our federal government to snoop on global transactions. And in many cases, we've been able to uncover plots against us and our partners through the SWIFT banking transactions. We've been able to uncover transfers of money that raised red flags. We've been able to uncover global money laundering schemes, global human trafficking efforts, things like that. The reserve currency goes away. Our leadership in the world goes away. The SWIFT system collapses. Countries trade in other ways. They route through China instead. Not only does it make us more vulnerable for national security concerns, it makes us more vulnerable on the world stage. It makes it more expensive for you to travel abroad. We also get great access around the world by being the world leader. You can go anywhere on the planet virtually with very few exceptions, and people are going to treat you well because you are the leader of the world. There was a time when I was a kid living overseas where terrorism was a big thing, particularly Islamic extremists in the 1980s targeting Americans. Given my dad is Swedish, he's American, but his parents are Swedish. There were times my parents told me, tell people you're Swedish. You look it, you got the last name Erickson, tell people you're Swedish. But mostly, you wanted people to know you were an American because it meant something. After World War II, the entire world was in shambles except for us. And the Western world order realigned to put us in charge. And we realigned the Western world order to benefit us. If we decide it's too expensive for us to continue to lead the world, and we step aside, the entire global economic, monetary, and even trade systems realign against us. China's trying to do this. We're making it very easy with these tariffs. You think it's expensive right now. You ain't seen nothing yet. Look at Great Britain. Great Britain used to be the largest empire on the planet. The British Empire was so big the sun never set on it. And what they meant by that saying the sun never sets on the British Empire was it controlled so much of the world that it was always sunrise, always daylight somewhere in the world in a territory the British controlled. The British Empire collapsed. Britain is still a developed nation, but it's turned inward on itself. Its inflation is higher than ours. Its banking costs are higher than ours. Its trade costs are higher than ours. All of the costs of doing business are higher for the British than for us because we now lead the world. It used to all benefit them. It used to all benefit them. And now it benefits us. And if you've decided that the costs of global leadership are too high because the military engagements we have, because of the trade deals we have, what have you, you think this is expensive. It's like not understanding the ramifications of a divorce When you divorce yourself from that, you're going to experience something and you're not going to get back what you had. I hear, for example, the Trump administration says all the time, and Trump supporters say all the time, that, well, we've given up our manufacturing base, so they've screwed us out of good jobs in this country. No, they actually haven't. Our poor in this country are still wealthier than the poor in other countries. That's something that you don't see because you don't travel the world and see it. But poor Americans in Mississippi and in Appalachia are wealthier than the poor in Southeast Asia and even the middle class in Southeast Asia. You say we don't have good jobs in this country. Actually, our jobs have transitioned in this country. No, we don't make T-shirts in this country anymore. We don't. We grow the cotton and export it abroad, and they make the T-shirts. We don't make the TVs in this country anymore. We buy them from abroad. But you know what we make? We make world-class weapon systems. We now build data centers, and we make information. We don't just find information. We create information. We have a services economy because we're an advanced nation. Advanced nations can outsource their manufacturing to other countries. Now, that's not to say there's not some we should have here. We should have pharmaceuticals here. We should have microchips here. We should have things like that here. But do we really need to buy our underwear made in America? Our coffee cups, our toasters, our TVs? Do we really need to? Because if so, what you're saying is that you want to pay higher prices for those things because they can't be made as cheaply here as abroad. And once you started settling into our clothes should be more expensive and our TVs should be more expensive and our homes should be more expensive, you're going to have less money. Even when your wages go up, companies are still going to make a profit, so your wages aren't going to go up as much. You're still going to have less take home once you've bought all these things. Trump supporters talk about the cost of global leadership. I would encourage them to consider the benefits of global leadership. And once you've given up that global leadership, you're not going to get it back, or you're going to be hard to get it back. Don't give up leadership and then realize that was a mistake. And I'm afraid there are a lot of people who are selling this fantasy of we can be so much wealthier and better off if we abandon the world for ourselves. We are, as the wealthiest nation on the planet. You may not feel it, but you are. Congratulations. You live in the wealthiest planet on the earth. China is number 2, and it's behind us significantly. And you don't feel it, and you feel like everyone's taking advantage of you. They're not taking advantage of you. You're richer than them. You may not feel like it because you're looking at other Americans who've gotten ahead, and you're jealous of the other Americans, and you think, why am I not getting ahead and they are? Well, it must be the people abroad. No, it's because of domestic policies here at home, not trade and global policies. It's because the Democrats have screwed you, and even some Republicans have screwed you with policies here at home that protect Goliath and keep David from growing. Those are the policies we should be targeting, not the global economic system that places us at the center of it. We are at the center of the global economic system with spokes going out in directions connecting us to all other countries with all of their stuff flowing here. You break that wheel, you're not going to put it back together again. And Donald Trump seems intent on breaking the wheel, thinking that we'll have something better. You know what comes with a broken wheel? Inertia and lack of progress and friction and high costs. And that's not going to be good for us.
It's the Erick Erickson Show.
Greetings, welcome. If you're on the phones, be patient with me. I want to correct the record. I'm assuming the guy emailing me is a troll because his email is White Devil. So maybe a racist. I don't know. I've got no idea. But he says, I recall you were pretty critical of Biden when he said coal miners could learn to code. You're starting to sound like him more than you may realize. I think this guy is listening to somebody else, because my point is that many Americans in manufacturing jobs have already transitioned. I am not an advocate for getting rid of coal miners and making them learn to code, because we actually need coal miners in this country, and we should be propping up those industries. What I'm talking about is recreating industries in this country that are no more, which is the president's vision to bring a lot of manufacturing back to this country. But the workers who worked in those places have already moved to other jobs. Some of them have retired. Their children have different jobs, and in technology, there's no need for us to rebuild these industries in this country, except to the extent that it can fill a national security role. What Joe Biden wanted to do was for green new energy, drive people out of existing jobs and tell them, well, they can learn to code. But we actually need the people in those industries. We need coal miners in this country. We need oil field workers in this country. We need those people. What we don't need necessarily, however, is where there is no manufacturing facility to suddenly create one and transition people from one job into that job. I don't think this guy quite understands what I'm talking about, and probably hearing some version of some nonsense in his head. Joe Biden actually wanted to cost American workers their jobs. I don't want to cost American workers their jobs. I just see no reason to get American workers to give up the jobs they have for jobs from the 1950s. I want to take Bruce's phone call here before I move on. Bruce, welcome to the show. How are you?
Well, doing fine, sir. I really liked your last commentary. It was right on. And
Thank
what
you.
I called to share is I got involved with a woman who wanted oil money, and she wanted to be in the garment business and been overseas. And she told me that seeing the garment plants over there where they do the sewing, there are people outside the plant in a big line to get in the morning and let yesterday's workers go in. And there will be 30 to 50 people waiting out there to try and get a job if someone gets fired or falls over dead. And after they finish their day, if they didn't finish work correctly, they had to stay on their own time and correct it. And this woman knew that they were never, ever going to be able to sew clothing as cheap in this country as they did over in Southeast Asia. And it's just amazing because I don't think people in this country understand there are places like that. I was in the service in Korea and saw things that people did to make a living that you just thought, there's nobody in this country will ever do that. And I think some of your experience in travel may be able to shed light on that as well.
Yeah, Bruce, I do think that there are a lot of people on both sides live in bubbles, and they don't necessarily, they haven't experienced or seen these things. I mean, it's a reality here that you can make things cheaply in a country abroad that frees up capital of poor and middle class Americans to do other things, even such as take a vacation that people don't really appreciate. And we don't think in those terms often, and economists do, and none of us are economists. And, I saw a friend of mine this morning. He said the worst thing about what Donald Trump did is he's suddenly making kids who got economics degrees feel important. And that's the worst thing you could do. But it's kind of true. It's kind of true. I want to just real quick here at the end. I got asked in commercial break. Let me explain this one to you. What would I do, Erickson? If you were king for a day, what would you do instead? We've got to deal with this situation. We've got to deal with countries taking advantage of us. So first of all, let's talk about the idea that countries are taking advantage of us. As I said at the beginning of the show, many of the tariff claims that were made yesterday by the White House aren't actually true. South Korea, for example, has an 8.75% tariff on goods imported to South Korea. However, South Korea has a free trade agreement with the United States, and so 90% of what we import to Korea has a 0% tariff. And do you know what the tariff rate is on the other 10%? 0.79%. 0.79%. Take Switzerland. Jess, the economist, called in earlier, pointed out that we're imposing tariffs on Switzerland. 99% of our products to Switzerland do not actually have a tariff. The 1% of products we export to Switzerland are agriculture products that have a tariff, and that tariff is only about 5%. Take Israel. We are imposing a 17% tariff on Israel. Israel has a 0% tariff on American imports. 0%, except on like 5% of imports. And before Trump made his tariff agreement, Israel's finance minister agreed to get rid of even those tariffs. So we have 0% across the board tariffs on imports into Israel, but now we're sticking them with a 17% tariff. It doesn't actually make a lot of sense. The reason the president is doing this, if you want to make it make sense, is he believes we need to rebuild domestic capacity. And there are places where he is right. Pharmaceuticals, we should repatriate, particularly out of China for antibiotics. That makes a lot of sense. Microchips, we need to get that out of Taiwan as quickly as we can, in large part because if China invades Taiwan, we're sunk on that stuff. We need to get that out of there. There are a lot of things, though, that we don't need to make here. We can ally shore them. Instead of offshoring them, we find a third world country that we want to be allies with for strategic reasons, and we move our manufacturing base there. India is a great example of this. There are certainly things that have to be made here, and there are certainly plenty of things that are made here. But what some people don't understand, and in fact, people emailing me angrily about this, what they don't understand, we need to bring manufacturing. We have manufacturing here. You have this idealized image from TV from the 50s and 60s of people going to the factory and working all day building something, leaving the factory and going home. They still go to the factory. But you know what they're making now? Instead of making the car, they're making the highly technical part, or they're making the highly technical thing. They're making the airplane. They're making the Tesla. They're making the data center. They're making the computers for the data center. They're taking the raw materials from abroad and making them here. I have just south of me, there's a massive Kumho tire facility. One of the largest in the U.S. is here. We're making those high-end tires here for cars in this country. Down the road from me, there's a Hyundai plant. They're making Hyundais here in this country. We are making vehicles in this country. We are making products in this country. We're just making more highly technical products in this country, and we're taking the less technical products and we're moving them offshore. We should not be moving them to China. I'm okay with the tariffs on China. In fact, the tariffs that I think the president got right were the tariffs on the Chinese cheap products. We should be putting tariffs on those things strategically. I just don't think we should be putting a 40+% tariff on things made in Vietnam because we've got to deal with China. So what would I do? I would deregulate. I would cut a lot of the cost of doing business in this country. We're never going to get labor costs down. Here's data. Came up in commercial break. I got CNBC on the big TV in the office, and CNBC was pointing out that in the United States per hour, labor, the average hourly wage for a auto manufacturing employee in this country is $70 an hour. In Mexico, it's $6 an hour. In Canada, it's $20 an hour. It's 69% more expensive to make a car in the United States than it is to make it in Mexico. It is 33% more expensive to make a car in the United States than it is in Canada. And a lot of that is labor costs. $70 wage in the United States compared to a $6 wage in Mexico. There are a lot of poor Americans who need vehicles, and their cost to buy a vehicle is going to go up because of the tariff. You move manufacturing to this country, it's still going to be more expensive. And you say, but wait, they could get a job at the manufacturing facility. Are they going to move? Are they going to pack up, leave their family behind, move to where the manufacturing facility is, and hope to get a job? We could deregulate. We could make it cheaper for factories to build in this country. We could make it cheaper for them to employ people in this country. We could make it cheaper for them to fire people in this country. We could make it cheaper. That would lower costs. It still wouldn't get us down to where Mexico is, $6 an hour, but it would still be able to produce a cheaper vehicle, a cheaper part of this country. Deregulation would be great. Restructuring the tax code would be fantastic. We should get rid of the corporate tax. Get rid of the corporate tax in this country. People pay the corporate tax. Corporations don't actually pay the corporate tax. That's one of the things I think people forget, is that there's no such thing as a tax that any corporation in this country pays. It is paid for by higher prices to the consumers. They pass that on to the consumers, and there's no reason for that. There's no reason for it. We could simplify the tax code. This is Magic Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, talking to Larry Kudlow.
You, the Republicans in the House and Senate are completely united on this mission. We must accomplish the mission, Larry, because the big, beautiful bill is going to get the economy rocket-fueled again. I mean, this is how we're going to get the economy going. It's going to settle the bond markets and the stock market, I believe, because it will show that Congress is serious about reducing debt and the deficits. But also, the reason it will be rocket-fueled to the economy is because all the elements of it. We're going to do American energy dominance again. We're going to secure the border and do those basic things we promised on the campaign trail. But also we're going to ensure we don't have the largest tax increase in U.S. history. And allowing job creators and entrepreneurs and risk takers and companies to know what their tax rate is going forward is a really important part of that.
Yep, completely agree. Completely agree. You streamline the tax code, you give tax cuts, that's great. Yeah, I'll tell you what the message shouldn't be. There's a political site, the Quartering. Let me read you this tweet. You do not need the new iPad. You do not need the new cell phone. You do not need the new video game console. You want them. There's a big difference. And if you look at the people whining about the tariffs, I challenge you to ask them how their lives have been affected in any way. Well, they haven't been yet because the tariff hasn't been imposed, but we know the tariffs are going to apply to groceries. So your coffee price is going to go up. The price of your beer is going to go up. The price of your bananas are going to grow up. The price of your out-of-season produce is going to go up. That includes vegetables, that includes produce, that includes your fruit. Those prices are going to go up. You don't need the iPhone. You don't need the cell phone. But, those are also American jobs. Certainly they're made abroad, but Apple employs a whole lot of Americans who oversee those things, and wages are going to go up. But also this idea telling Americans you don't need these things, so stop whining, is not actually a good thing. That's degrowth. That is what the left says. That is a message from the left. The left believes we're too materialistic and it's hurting the environment and we need to spend less. And now here comes the woke right saying the same thing, using slightly different words. But you don't need these things. Stop buying these things. You're not going to be impacted by tariffs. You don't want it? Stop buying the coffee. Save your money. Don't buy the big Starbucks. This is the message of the left. You know who was one of the loudest critics of the trade deficit? You know who one of the loudest critics of trade deficits have been in this country? Here, let me play you this. You might recognize this voice. This is one of the loudest critics of trade deficits in American history.
How far does China have to go? How much more repression? How big a trade deficit and loss of jobs for the American worker? And how much more dangerous proliferation has to exist before members of this House of Representatives will say, I will not endorse the status quo? As I mentioned, it's about jobs, proliferation, and human rights. And there are those who say we shouldn't link human rights and trade and proliferation and trade. I disagree. But if we just want to take up this issue on the basis of economics alone, indeed, China should not receive most favored nation status for several reasons that I'd like to go into now. I'd like to call the attention of our colleagues to this chart on the status quo that the business community is asking each and every one of us to endorse today. Right now, we have a $34 billion trade deficit with China, the 1995 figure. It will be over $40 billion for 1996.
That's Nancy Pelosi from 1996 arguing that trade deficits with China are bad. Now, I got to tell you that I actually agree with her on most favored nation status for China. I remember one of the first letters I ever wrote to anyone was to my member of Congress urging them to reject most favored nation status for China because they were communists. At the time, global leaders were convinced roping China into the World Trade Organization and the like would be good and calm the Chinese communist authoritarian influence. They were very wrong. But Pelosi was upset about trade deficits. It's kind of wild that people on the right are now where Nancy Pelosi was in 1996. Occupy Wall Street today is upset that Donald Trump's the one who imposed the tariffs, but they like the tariffs. I mean, what is happening here? Again, you don't need the experts. You don't need the experts. You need history. And history shows us what typically happens with tariffs. Now, here's the thing. I could be wrong here. I could absolutely be wrong. Maybe everybody else is right. Maybe they're right. Maybe Milton Friedman's wrong. Maybe Adam Smith is wrong. Maybe Thomas Sowell is wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we're wrong. Will you acknowledge it, though, that if you're wrong, will you acknowledge it? Because I've got to acknowledge it for the sake of intellectual honesty and the credibility of this program. I got to acknowledge it when I'm wrong. Started this program today and said I was wrong about something yesterday. Are you going to be willing to acknowledge it? I think most of the people who like to hang on to when everyone else is wrong don't like to acknowledge when they're wrong. Will you acknowledge it if you're wrong? If we head into a recession, or will you find an excuse to say, well, it wasn't really that, it was something else? Because the economists, major economists right now, left, right, and center are all predicting this will slow the economy and put us into a recession, probably, not guaranteed, but probably. But it will definitely slow economic growth in this country, hurt our portfolios, and hurt jobs in the economy, produce layoffs. Will anybody be willing to admit they were wrong if that happens? Because those are the predictions right now. I don't know. I give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt. This is what he wants to do. Let's see how they play out. But I am a student of history. I do have a degree in that. I do know how this has played out in the past. My prediction is it'll play out the same way. The Trump administration says it'll play out differently because times have changed. We're going to find out before the midterms. It'll either help the GOP or wipe them out. Rand Paul's predicting a wipeout next year because of it. We'll see. Now, what I do know is that bank stocks are kind of down today because they do depend on global trade and interest rates and things like that. But one bank standing firm is Old Glory Bank. They're a conservative bank by conservatives for conservatives. They would love to have your banking business for yourself or for your business.
Now,
Welcome back. It's Erick Erickson here. So I will, yesterday I made a prediction at the end of the show. I said I didn't think the tariffs were going to have that much stock market fallout. Didn't think they were going to be that big. Well, I was wrong. I'm going to make another prediction, though. I suspect that the tariffs are going to be adjusted. I think we're going to see countries reach out. I think there will be negotiations. I do not think we will have a global 10% tax. It may be a federal judge steps in. It would be kind of be funny. There's this thing that the Supreme Court conservatives have embraced, the major questions doctrine. Major questions have to be answered by the Congress, not by regulators. And while the president has some latitude to impose tariffs, the actual statute that gives the president this power, those tariffs are clearly intended to be in strategic tariffs, not broad tariffs. You may see a federal judge say you can't actually implement this policy. You need congressional approval to do it. But my suspicion is one way or the other, we're not actually going to see the tariffs at the levels through negotiations, a judge or something. The president may be changing his mind after gauging market reaction. Right now he says they're going well, and he predicts $6 to $7 trillion in tariff revenue, which actually isn't possible, and we actually know this based on the trade with these other countries that we can't generate that much money. But nonetheless, I just don't think this is the end of it. I think we're going to see changes come from this administration one way or the other and how they implement it. So we'll see. I've tried to play it straight with you. I don't like them. I do think they're a bad idea, but I at least understand why the president says he's trying to do it, rebuild manufacturing, make us less dependent on the world, things like that. In a globally integrated economy, though, I just don't know where this thing lands.